This project was one of Paul Rudolph's first projects out of graduate school, and basically separated himself from his previous partner. It was really his first project on his own. And it seems it's really kind of like an essay. We were talking about this earlier today. It's really like a big school project. There's a kind of thesis. There's the clarity of an idea. There is an exploration of how that execution is developed in real terms of constructability, and I think that's the thing that's one of the most interesting things to me about the project. It's interesting also to me because you look at this from it's very much conceived as an ideal house or an ideal project, right? What is its geometric purity? What's the clarity of its rationality? And there's a logic about its composition.
It was a real simple geometry that was established by Paul in this, which was kind of interesting, in that it was a 9 square overall layout and it's rigid geometry of the plan, and then it was actually a square in its volume also in each of those 9 squares, which is sort of an really interesting kind of formwork and frame to it, and the formalness of the overall frame and it's the logic of it that it's raised up off the ground to allow potential high tide coming in. It is really a building for the area, it's a vernacular building in a lot of ways. It was meant for this location. Screen walls open to the air. It's a ventilated structure, and that's what we find as sort of the clarity of that is really pretty interesting, as well as having his love of the sea and kind of shipbuilding and using all of those components as part of this framework.
I questioned a few moves about, say, just the way the bathroom and utilities were conceived here. I would have liked to have seen those elements be engaged in the composition a little bit more actively. Right now they feel like they were kind of not fully engaged, that they were kind of compromises of that pure form. We were saying earlier about that situation is that had this been Mies van der Rohe at the Farnsworth House, every element is conceived as an object or a shape within the overall envelope of the steel and glass frame, right? Composition. Here it gets compromised, and the module is compromised within that. And I'm scratching my head about that. I would think this is something that someone of Rudolph's stature would not have. I'd like to know what that explanation was for that. But I would want to tweak that, and I want to do it right now as I'm walking through it. It's like, can we pull the wall away from that column and get that to work just right? So I guess that's the first thing. But the other thing, and maybe a bigger question, that was raised about kind of the site specificity of this, because we were talking earlier about, well, how would you adapt this to a desert environment, for instance? Because here we are from Sarasota to Palm Springs. In so many ways, this is a completely opposite situation. This is designed for a tropical climate, right? Hot, humid. In those environments, if you think about what a hut looks like in the South Seas Island, everything's elevated off the ground for tidal shifts. It's also elevated off the ground to allow air circulation around in that environment. We're also looking at complete building envelope permeability, because airflow is so critical, right? In this case, it's following that absolutely well. Mm-hmm. But to change that and adapt it to a desert environment, in my mind, requires a complete reconceptualization of the project. With all that said, I would also be curious to see how well this would feel, how comfortable this is, say, in the mild months in the desert, where we are right now. The winter months, maybe this works okay, right? It's something that you'd want to really try. It's definitely a a trial that you want to look at this, because if you were to start from scratch and say, oh, we're going to do a desert house, it would never look like this. But maybe in the mild climate, a desert house like this might work in certain circumstances.
I think probably just dovetailing on what Rick was saying, knowing that this was obviously taking into account that it was planned for Sanibel Island and a tropical climate, it pretty much does everything you'd want something like this to do. It was well thought out. I guess some of we were having the same discussion. The bathroom core does seem like was compromised with the purity of the structure, but maybe that was cleverly intended by Paul just to mess with us. I don't know. So we would all talk about
just
it.
To hurt us.
Yeah, just to mess with us. Because it's one of the first, when we actually got the drawings and we were looking at it, we were all, we were trying to place it here in this pit we initially looked at it, do we place it in the same orientation that the sun orientation it is in Florida? And then we were saying, well, this thing was sort of placed irrespective of that, so we might as well look at it. We'll place it how we think it would fit as a marketing tool for the building. So we thought that was a good. It's just we can justify it that way. I guess we felt, but as knowing that it's something like this you wouldn't do here. I think just as a purity of what Paul was trying to do. That's the biggest question I have is the kind of functional bathroom and kitchen. The kitchen I think I'm not so concerned about. But the bathroom was odd.
So I'd like to add to that question also, because one of the things I'm always particularly interested in is how light and color affect the way we perceive space, right? And in this case, everything is painted white. The structural frame, the infill panels, and the only point of emphasis are the little red balls that are the counterweights, and then of course a gray plane and these gray interior walls. If you look carefully at the original photographs of the project, you actually see that the ceiling was not painted white. There was a tan color and was originally a grass cloth material. And looking at those photographs compared to what I see here, I see that the white surface actually unifies the composition in a way that the articulation of a single plane in a different tone, it changes the way you perceive the form. It creates something that looks more monolithic, more integrated, less linear. As soon as that surface is articulated as a different tone or a different color, what is then emphasized is the linear quality of the frame. Yeah. Suddenly the top header and the columns and the header that continues out and becomes a support system for the spider legs on the exterior is articulated in a new way, and it changes the way you perceive space. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something we debated about this early on, about what color is this thing? Was it really white? It looked like in some of the photographs that it was originally painted like a peach color or a tan color or a sand color, and we were trying to understand what the intention was behind the color of the form, right? And we really didn't come to a conclusion about what that original palette was, because the color really makes a big difference in the way you understand the idea, right? If it were white, like it is now, that implies a kind of rational, classical idea, right? Back to the Greeks, back to the Greeks. It's the Parthenon in some way. Until, of course, you understand that the Parthenon was never really white. It was always painted. And it undermines that vision or that misconception of what we think the idea is of somebody from the past. So we're kind of trying to understand that relative to this project as well. What were Paul Rudolph's ideas? What's the clearest representation of those ideas? How did color reinforce that idea? And was it something about the abstraction of it? Or was it something that was about the specificity of the site? Was it a sand color because that sand color might relate to the ground color,
Plain,
potentially? Or was it white as opposed to a perfect ideal? And at this point, I still don't know the answer to that about this project.
This period of once Paul graduated from school, and sort of his influences or his mentors, et cetera, at Yale, and there was a lot of exploration and experimentation going on right at that period of time in the 50s. We kind of equate this a little bit to Rick and I were talking about this, is that the growth of Florida at this time was almost similar to it was behind, but certainly of modernism was almost the same time of growth of a little bit behind of Los Angeles, but right around a similar time of exploration of modern form was going on, and it was, both of them were blank canvases at the time. There was a lot of freedom in thinking. There was a lot of land to do things. We've seen pictures of when this house was built. There was nothing else on this sandbar. We have a kind of a grainy black and white photo someone took from a plane right after it was completed, and it is off by itself. There's nothing else there. It was way before the land boom that was happening. It was just starting to happen in Florida. Trains were starting to bring people to it. There was a lot of wealth that was coming down to the area. So we think it was all kind of a really fantastic time to start experimenting with experimenting with architecture. And there was a lot of it going on in this. There was little to try and match what was going on. There was very little even vernacular architecture in this area. Mm-hmm. So it was really kind of an exciting time. But it was obviously the rigor of Paul's learning and who he worked with was all a period of that, thinking of inexpensive housing. This really was an inexpensive project to build, and something that could be erected quickly. And it was kind of part of that whole system, and part of sort of the industrial thinking of building. It was all part of it.
Mm-hmm. The time period influenced this architecture in an interesting way. Obviously, this was a post-World War II project. Rudolph was in school during World War II, and he in fact bracketed his studies at Harvard. The first semester he was at Harvard was his introduction to Gropius, a group of 15 students working with Gropius. He then entered the military for a few years, and then came back and finished in 1946. His last semester at Harvard. So he had this extreme, experience in that critical point, from being at the, learning at the foot of Walter Gropius and all these extraordinarily talented people around him. Philip Johnson was a classmate of his, and among those 15. And from there, moving into the most practical of applications, which is in the military. That experience of having both theory and practice in such extremes, I would think, is probably evident in this project. This looks like some kind of an amphibious device, right? That you might expect that the Navy would come up with. Like, you can pack this thing up into a crate, and you can float it onto a vessel, and then it could be transported and deployed, like some kind of landing mechanism, right? And then it finds its place and it opens up, and now it can almost walk away. It's so light on its feet or on its multiple legs, right? So it seems to have both of those kind of super practical and pragmatic ideas about it, and also this very high-minded clarity of concept, right? That I would think, wow, that seems to come right out of this kind of unusual education. I can't imagine how many architects actually interrupted their B-Arch or M-Arch by 3 years in the military, right? So I think that's kind of a very unique circumstance. And then if the climate were different, this house could easily be a case study project from Southern California, right? It very much follows the same ethos of experimentation and orientation in terms of efficiency, but also being specific to a climate and specific to a place. All right. So I think this is, I mean, it's a great project to have here in or in Southern California for how you can compare and contrast the innovative traditions we have in Southern California compared to what was happening in Florida. And now we have this little interloper to examine.
I was the architectural designer from the board who worked with the original drawings, courtesy of the Sarasota Architectural Foundation, and Joe King, architect in Bradenton and Sarasota, who originally created the replica that we're sitting in today. And I coordinated with him to understand the project, to sort of help our board understand the complexities and the realities of bringing the project to Palm Springs. It was definitely a key element of the experience, while not at all, obviously, because of the nature of the installation and it being created for a different, in a different setting, but also not for that. It's entirely a sort of a secondary concern, but definitely one that we wanted to at least make sense of and try to bring as much context as we could for the experience of the guest house. And it also was a unique one in that even the Sarasota folks and also the original, people who experienced the original Walker Guest House in Sanibel Island, Florida, have never seen it from above as a primary way of introducing this thing. So it does have a sort of conceptual viewing or an abstract viewing for the vast majority of people before they even decide whether or not they're coming in. The goal is to basically have it available and open for visitation by as many people as we can encourage to take the trip. And so that's our initial premise, and then beyond that point, it's indeterminate. We've had it seems like it does invite speculation by many of our visitors have come and started to think about where they could have this project if they could have it in their own hands. And so it seems to be something that does encourage the imagination as far as folks visiting and seeing themselves actually living sensibly in this fairly small footprint, which is really great to see. I mean, it's not often that you see in home tours and things like that, sometimes you see people visiting and saying, oh, well, it would be nice to live here, or it wouldn't be nice to live here, and making that decision. But to really imagine taking something and moving it to wherever they wanted it, or wherever the land that's comfortable or home to them is. And so I think that's a sort of an interesting sort of shade on the experience. This simultaneously taught me a number of things about proportion and simplicity, and about organization and order. And I think I learned almost as much from Joe King, the creator of this replica, as I did from studying Paul Rudolph and his background, although I think that for me, the connection with Rudolph was a pretty strong one in terms of grounding my understanding of his work, which was largely based on being in some of his bigger, heavier, more well-known buildings that were done later in his career. Well, this project started with, it was the brainchild of Joe King, the architect in Bradenton and Sarasota, who worked with the Sarasota Architectural Foundation after having done extensive research for co-authoring a book on Paul Rudolph's Florida houses, which is an excellent resource about his work, and very well put together. And Joe basically created a kit of parts design that would allow them to replicate the original Walker Guest House in as close a sort of rigorous appreciation of Rudolph's initial ideas as possible, while still maintaining or adjusting for contemporary materials and availability of things, as well as some construction conveniences or inconveniences of making something that is actually a reconstructible kit of parts, which was not the Walker Guest House's initial premise. It wasn't designed to be moved around or be taken apart. So Joe's efforts to make it more durable throughout the change of taking the pieces apart and actually storing them and shipping them was something that was intact in his, or was part of his initial design concept. And as far as bringing the project to Palm Springs was concerned, it was really the initiation came from a board member, Stephen Rose, who knew that the Walker Guest House was in storage, had been part of Sarasota's temporary installation for a year and a half or so, and that it was something that was potentially available for bringing to Palm Springs if we, the Palm Springs Modern Committee, thought that it was the right thing to do. And in conversations with Dick Burkett, another fellow board member, and myself, and then the rest of the board, it became something that kind of gained momentum and energy as the excitement about bringing a new piece of architecture from the mid-century modern period to Palm Springs really started to sort of wash over people. I mean, it's a key piece of design from the period that this group has, that our preservation organization has taken as important to sort of continue to support. The Sarasota Architectural Foundation has a similar, I think, mission to the Palm Springs Modern Committee, which is an architectural appreciation and preservation oriented group. Actually, I think Sarasota has had a competitively strong and expansive stock of amazing architecture done by a wide range of talented architects in that area, many of whom cross paths with in some way or another with Paul Rudolph and his partners and other students and associates. And the architecture there really actually was more threatened because Florida and the Gulf Coast of Florida didn't have that sort of period of kind of fallow time or quiet time that Palm Springs had. I mean, here this place got sort of fell out of fashion, basically. It was a little bit less attended to and it wasn't over-invested in, whereas coastal Florida has pretty much been popular in real estate up and down throughout the last 6 to 8 decades. And so while there will be real estate sort of busts, they don't last very long, maybe a few years, and then people are back buying when the prices go back down. And so a lot of Sarasota's best architecture did get knocked down or taken by folks who decided to replace modern buildings with more regional style or perhaps more sort of postmodern trimmings and other sort of non-preservation oriented design ideas. What would I change about this house if I could? It's a really good question. I think first and foremost, it's site. I mean, obviously, without taking away from the strange and interesting experience that the pit created for us, and an opportunity both for a sort of secure and also a sort of strange way of approaching it from above and then down and ultimately up to the house. I think there are the potential of this site to be in a place where the connection between, I mean, clearly it was designed with certain intentional limitations. The idea of having these flaps that open up as shades is a brilliant one in and of itself as far as just the abstract, non-sited situation. But I think it really, it was one of my key misgivings or concerns about the siting of the project in its place, because I value the experience of the mountains so greatly here in Palm Springs. And the idea that you would have, you would welcome people in and have a situation where the wall comes up to a certain level, but the real key view continues to go above that restriction, was something I really couldn't get my head around. There's only so many places that can be home, on home tours. And this the original Walker Guest House is fairly remote from Sarasota. So it's an hour and a half to 2 hours away in Sanibel Island. So it's by design, it was remote in order for the Walker family to enjoy it, and so the idea of bringing this to the Ringling Museum for exhibit was a great one as a way of really sharing what one of the best designs and the simplest designs that it would have been forgotten in the context of sort of continual press of attention on modern architecture, but is really one of the sort of instigators of great modern design.